Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. And on this week's episode, we are going to talk about correlation of social connectedness, health, and happiness. And our guest today is Andy Proctor, who's going to be sharing with us a lot of knowledge in this area. And Andy is a psychology Ph.D. student studying how social connection impacts health and well-being, and is a certified positive psychology practitioner, CAPP. His podcast, More Happy Life, has been featured in the New York Times, ABC News, and Fox News. He is a regular contributor to Psychology Today and co-chair of the Utah Positive Psychology Association. He is on the TEDx BYU board and the research team for Eventbrite's Social Connection Project. His work on teen well-being has been featured in USA Today, Teen Vogue, and The Hill. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andy.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, you have a podcast yourself. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so it's the More Happy Life podcast. It's a fun project that I've done for, probably 5 years or so. And I just love nerding out about anything that helps to increase happiness by just a little bit, anything at all. And so there's a wide variety of topics that qualify there, as you probably know.
Yeah, and, definitely.
So it's a fun project.
It's like a two worlds collide kind of thing, because our podcast is also about happiness. And so today we'll have a lot of fun talking about happiness and more. And, you probably have a lot of insights to share with us. So out of curiosity, how did you choose to do this work?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, before I started my PhD program, I was really into, more just like the general positive psychology world, right? And like anything along the spectrum of Marty Seligman's kind of perma theory of happiness and well-being and human flourishing. I was just like all about any of that. I did the certification in positive psychology. Friends with a lot of people who've gone to there's a program at the University of Pennsylvania called the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program. So I actually applied to that a couple of times. Actually never got in, but ended up getting into this PhD program, and which it was really great because it allowed me to really dive deep into not just kind of a broad overview of positive psychology, which I kind of had already done with my certification program, but a really kind of more in-depth view of what a lot of positive psychology researchers say is the number one predictor of well-being, which is positive relationships, right? So if you look at the PERMA, which stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning and achievement, the R, right, the relationships factor is really one that is probably the most salient. And so yeah, that's kind of how I was able to, that's kind of the interest that kind of led me to studying more or less social connection and social relationships, and initially a deep interest in adult friendship. And so that's kind of, that was like the interest that led me to it. And how I got into it was I was actually in kind of industry or like the corporate world before, and I was, doing a project that led to me being on the TEDx BYU board. And as a member of that committee, I'm able to, recommend people to give, speeches about what they do, and so we're always trying to find like really interesting people, whether they're like scientists or social activists or, just really interesting comedians or like artists, dancers. And there was one individual who she had a lot of people actually had given TED Talks about her research already. Some of them had like millions of views, right? And but she had never given her own. And so I ended up reaching out to her and saying, hey, would you ever want to give your own TED Talk? And that person was Julianne Holt-Lundstad, who is really a global expert in social connection and health. She's done a lot of work in that area and is very well known for that. And so I reached out to her and asked her about that. And so she ended up doing it. I was her speaker coach for that, which was really fun. And we went through that together. I say we got through that together because it was actually during COVID. And it was kind of crazy. We actually had to cancel the event like 3 days before it happened in March. Anyways, but we developed a good relationship through that. And then when I actually interviewed her for my podcast, she asked me at the end if I'd ever considered, doing a PhD program and studying friendship and kind of the solution, not just, what the problem is that exists, which is loneliness, which, didn't just start with a pandemic. It's been an issue for decades. And so when she asked me that, I, of course, said, yes, I'm very interested. And so that's kind of how that began. And and I applied and got in, thankfully. So,
yay! Congratulations.
Yeah, so she's my advisor currently, and she's amazing.
Oh, that's a beautiful story, and I'm very happy to hear that. It's also really inspiring because you never know where life's going to take you, and for you it worked out. It's so great. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get to know you even better now. We have this section called Have You Met Andy? We're going to get some of your recommendations or things on top of your list, per se. First of all, what is a book you would recommend to our audience?
Oh, boy. I love... So from a personal standpoint, I love Harry Potter.
No, you do not.
No, I really do love Harry Potter, but I just had to throw that out because I thought it was hilarious. Prisoner of Azkaban is probably my favorite of all the books.
No way.
Just for the record, yes.
That is my favorite.
Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I was like, okay, thank you. Finally, a Potterhead on this podcast. Thank you. Finally.
Hey, we can talk about that all day. Positive psychology and Harry Potter, another episode for another day.
Absolutely.
Probably one of the books that I've been thinking a lot about lately is a book from Marissa Franco. Actually, she wrote a book called Platonic, and it's about friendship. And she's done some research on friendship, but she really does a great job of kind of gathering all the good stuff around adult friendship and kind of making synthesizing it into really great, bite-sized recommendations that people who want to improve their, platonic relationships can follow. So I just love it. I've loved it. It's really recent. So that's kind of like, it's kind of been on my mind. So.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting because I think for me personally, friendship is on the top of my list in terms of, the relationships, and friends can be family sometimes. So add it to cart. That's what I just did while you're talking. Thank you for that. Next question. What is a movie you would recommend? And please don't say Prisoner of Azkaban.
No, just like all the answers are Harry Potter. No. A movie that I would recommend, I really love, there's a movie called About Time and it's beautiful. It's so, like, from a positive psychology standpoint, I can't even remember when it came out, but it's about this guy who can, basically he discovers that he can travel back in time, and that it's like this thing that like runs in the male side of his family, and so he gets to go back and kind of just change anything that he wants to change and like do differently. And so, I mean, any kind of movies that like are messing with time, you know, it's kind of interesting, but like The Prisoner of Azkaban. And
You did not. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Continue.
time turner, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, like, but it's neat because, I mean, I don't want to spoil it for anybody who actually wants to go watch it, because I highly recommend it if you haven't. But he learns that, you know, even when you can go back in time and change something, maybe you don't want to, and maybe it's okay to just like experience it and savor it and be grateful for what you get, even if it's not what you thought you were going to get.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, when you were talking, I Googled. It came out in 2013. And I do remember watching this movie a really long time ago. It's a great one. And, you know, sometimes it's just good to watch it again. So I might just do that. Thank you for sharing. Next question is about your favorite podcast. Now, this is tricky because you host a podcast and you're a guest on probably many podcasts too. So which one would you recommend?
Oh, gosh. You know, that is tricky. I think there's so many podcasts that come to mind, but something that has caught my attention recently more is a podcast that, okay, I'm going to say two because I have to tell you how I got there. So the first podcast was called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. So sorry to be on a Harry Potter thing here, but it led me to one that was called Honestly, with Barry Weiss, and just talks about like how we can have conversations with people that we may not agree with, but like that we can still be friendly to people who are different. You know, I think it's such an important thing right now for everyone to learn that skill and to feel comfortable with, because it is uncomfortable, but I think it's the reason why there's a lot of issues right now, not just in my country, the United States, but in the whole world. Like it's an issue, I think. So that's been something that's really been, you know, making me think a lot about what's having an impact on people's well-being and loneliness and happiness and their feeling of being able to speak freely. So.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. And now I believe you when you said everything's going to be about Harry Potter. You remind me of one of our. you remind me of one of our colleagues who just slips in every conversation. There will be a Harry Potter reference. So, you know, shout out to you, Abdallah, if you're listening. Great job. Yes. Now you have found your pal, Andy. You guys should talk. It'll be a fun conversation.
Yeah. I'm a rapist.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Next one might also be about Harry Potter. I wouldn't be surprised. Who is your role model? Now, it doesn't have to be a famous person. Could be someone in your circle or a fictional character.
Yeah. Wow. I love that question so much. So I think there's so many different roles. And okay, so there's a book called The Book Thief. It's like, I don't know, pretty famous. And I just became a dad like almost a year and a half ago. And so we had our first kid. And so I think a lot about fatherhood and what it means to be a dad. And there's this fictional character actually in the book, and his name's Hans Uberman. And I just, gosh, I know it's kind of weird to have a role model that's like not like, that's like a book character, but I've thought a lot about him as like he actually doesn't have a child, but he's a father figure to like a lot of different characters who kind of come and go in the book. And he's just an amazing archetype. Anyways, I really like that person.
Yeah.
Hans Uberman.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, this is actually the first time we've had a fictional character as a role model on this podcast. So that's fun for us. Thank you for sharing that. Final question. What is a course you've completed that left a really strong impact on you?
Yeah. Okay. This is an easy one for me. So I took the certification in applied positive psychology back in 2019. I think it was like a 7-month program. So I guess it was 2018, 2019. And it was amazing. It was like the best educational experience I've ever had, for one. Even after going through an undergrad and a PhD program, like still the best educational experience I've ever had. It was transformational. It was an amazing experience where I bonded with other people, where my wife and I did it together. And so it gave us this like shared language that we're able to use in our marriage and family. And anyways, great experience. Yeah, I loved it.
That sounds
it's
amazing.
Called CAP. Yeah, it's like certification in applied positive psychology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was in your bio. So yeah, that's great to learn more, context about that particular certification. Thank you.
Yeah, and you can put it in your bio.
Yeah, and you can put it in your bio. CAP. Very cool. Thank you for sharing all of those. We got to know you a bit better now. So it's time to talk about today's topic, correlation of social connectedness, health, and happiness. It is a mouthful, but the key is social connectedness, which is something that you study. And I think that is definitely something that we need to talk more about, especially as you mentioned at the very beginning, loneliness has become sort of an epidemic or, like a really big problem all over the world. And I think everyone could benefit more from, learning about social connectedness, and how we can actually nurture that. So to give it some context, you have a podcast which is about happiness. This podcast is about happiness. We have to talk about happiness. What does happiness mean to you personally?
Yeah, man, that's such a good question. I think happiness is a practice. I think just like yoga is a practice, happiness is like you go to yoga and it's not always perfect, right? And it's never going to be perfect, right? Because it's a practice. You're always practicing. And I think happiness is a practice in the same way. And has skills, just like yoga, you develop skills for yoga, you can develop skills for happiness. And so, happiness skills are things like prioritizing activities that give you life, that like just light you up, like really prioritizing them, actually putting them in your calendar, with a reminder to do it, and pursuing things that are meaningful to you, like really meaningful, life-changingly meaningful. That's huge. And then I think optimizing your life, which we'll talk about, for positive social connection, like it's huge. It's so big. Happy people are connected people.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe happiness. Happy people are connected people. I like that. It's actually true, because when I think about how the different definitions about happiness have come up, a lot of people mention their relationships. So, their connection with not only their family, their friends, their partners, but with others in general. And sometimes it's a sense of community too. It doesn't have to be just, one-on-one connection. So I'm sure we'll go into that a bit more in depth. Before we get into social connection, I want to just kind of debunk some misconceptions about happiness with you. We have a bunch of misconceptions we've debunked before on this show, but you have your own show about it. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you have found, through your work, maybe through your podcast, and especially through your current research?
Wow. I'll try to answer that question. So I think a big one is idealizing and pursuing a goal that you see on somebody else's like social media feed. Like it might, like maybe that thing will make you happy, but for how long, right? Like, and if you really want to say like get rich or like quit your job and travel the world, like you might find that the process of getting rich or the process and practicality of quitting your job, like, and traveling the world, like, is something that, like leads you to a place that isn't actually good for your happiness or well-being or like mental health on a day-to-day. And so I think, I guess I would just say that I think that's a big one that I mentioned that one because like social media is so pervasive everywhere, and it's like there's a group dynamic effect like globally that's happening. Like there's no country now. Well, I actually don't know for sure about that, but like almost every country, like the majority of like everyone has a smartphone that's connected to social media. And I'm not saying social media is bad. I'm just saying that it's ubiquitous in that everyone uses it. And if you don't use it, you are the outlier. And so there's all these weird things that can happen if you are not on social media consistently, socially, right? From a social psychology standpoint, like you think you're different, you think you're not fitting in, you think you should be doing it, right? And so then you do it, but because most social media apps and platforms are not built actually for connection, they're built for engagement, and their algorithms that create engagement are mostly built to get people riled up. Like that's what engages people the most. And unfortunately, that's kind of what drives a lot of the ad revenue, which is what keeps the companies going. So from a business standpoint, it makes sense. From a well-being and social connection and happiness standpoint, it's really not, it's not helpful for a lot of people who just have what most people do for their default. So, or they're just modeling what other people do, or they, I think like anyone with a smartphone, most people, I think it's only like 40% of people. This is a statistic from a couple of years ago, so I don't know if it's actually up to date, but only 40% of people turn off their notifications or do anything at all to change their notification settings from the default of everything, which is really not good for mental health. So anyways, so yeah, I kind of went off on a little bit of a rabbit hole there, but I guess I would just say find something where, the process is fulfilling, not just the outcome.
Yep.
I don't always recommend quitting your job because, financial stability is a huge predictor of health and happiness. And those are, those are helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I think it has to make sense as well. It's not just something that people say and it sounds great, so you go ahead and you do it without considering what it actually means for you personally, right? And the social media topic is certainly fascinating, especially for today's topic, social connectedness, because social media was sort of branded as this thing that would connect people. And as you were saying, it's not built for connection. So what exactly is social connectedness?
Yeah. So social connectedness, I would say, can be defined in a lot of different ways. But I personally like to think of it as friendship, in terms of friendship, and a good and I'll talk about friendship for a second, and then also kind of your community. So friendship is like the close, and then the community is like the people that are in your peripheral, but also like that you're not necessarily always close with. So yeah, like I would say a good friendship, first of all, comes with what an author that I really loved her book, Shasta Nilsson. She wrote a book called Frientimacy, really good book. And she gave a TED Talk, I think, with the same title. If you want to just like watch the TED Talk for the 15-minute summary, but it includes 3 things: vulnerability, intimacy, which includes intimacy, consistency, and positivity. So vulnerability, consistency, and positivity. So if you don't have, if you have, consistency and positivity, but you never really like go deep with somebody, it's going to be lacking. If you have vulnerability and consistency, but like it's always negative, like that's also not very good. If you have vulnerability and positivity, but like you never see them, like, that it can be great, but it's also, it's like your Uber driver, right? Like that you have a great conversation with and you never see him again. So good friendship has all 3 of those. And Shasta Nilsson did a good job of, I think, summarizing that. And there's actually a lot of research that can back it up as well that I've been exposed to in this program. So social connection also, like I said, includes the depth of our network, like our whole social network, all the circles that you have that can take into account family, neighborhood involvement, event participation, involvement with like a team or a club or like a religious group or a, nonprofit organization or whatever, anything that you belong to, that you perceive that you belong to, that you go to hopefully regularly and have some sort of a role in, right? And like if you live in a neighborhood, you have a role in that neighborhood. You're a person in the neighborhood. You're a community member, right? If you are a part of a team, like you're a teammate. If you're a part of, like right now I'm in a cohort of Ph.D. students, like I belong to that. It's great. We're a powerful little group. I go to a church. I'm a part of the Utah Positive Psychology Association. I'm a part of all these like things that we don't meet all the time, but I belong to them and they're a part of who I am. And so, yeah, those are really important things when it comes to health and happiness, actually, not just the super close friendships with those 3 things that I mentioned, but also just those, those kind of more kind of peripheral relationships that you may just see every once in a while, but that you're a part of. So, yeah.
So, to build on that point, that is interesting. So you mentioned friendships, which, gotta actually meet 3 criteria, not just one. Then you have all these different social groups, communities that you belong to. And I'm curious because for a lot of people, they might have both of that. They have friendships, they have communities they belong to, but they still have a sense of loneliness. And the sense of social connectedness is not really there. Does it matter the quantity or is it a matter of quality?
So if I had to choose one of those, I would say quality would win. But they're both important.
Yeah.
Because especially in the westernized kind of world, for men, it's really important to have a diversity of friends and a diversity of not just friends, but just a diverse kind of community of relationships that you can tap into, because as we age, and this isn't just for men, I think, it's both men and women, but women for whatever reason, and often, this is just like from, past research that I'm citing, but like often they're really good at keeping relationships and building new friendships and going deeper, right? And you asked the question about loneliness. Can we belong to a lot of those, clubs or groups or go to classes if we're in school, or if we, can we be surrounded by people and still feel lonely? And absolutely, it's actually pretty common, because, I think most people are not objectively socially isolated. But and I'm not sure globally, but in the United States, about 50, a little over 50% of people say that they feel lonely, either sometimes or often. And so that's kind of a big deal. Lots of people are lonely right now, and they might have people that they interact with, but I think loneliness is a subjective perception of isolation, and a lot of people have defined it in different ways. But I think when it comes down to it, it's an emotional perception of this like isolated feeling where you don't feel understood, you don't feel seen or known by even the people that you are, close to. So that's kind of what I would say to answer that question. I don't know if that answers your question, but
oh yeah, no, totally. I think it's just good to know, because for some people, they might listen, the audience might listen to this podcast and they might go, okay, then I need to find a lot of communities and participate in activities, but that might not solve the problem, because the quality of the relationship and the feeling of belongingness is important, and it's hard to nurture, and sometimes it takes a few tries. And so I think it is a good point to kind of keep in mind when you go around thinking about, okay, building social connections that would help with my happiness. There's a caveat to that. It's not that as long as you build social connections, you're going to boost your happiness, because I find that personally that having the wrong kinds of connections or the wrong kinds of communities can be damaging to your happiness. Yep. And actually, you mentioned this in your definition of happiness earlier. Social connectedness or social connections. That is a clear anchor in your definition of happiness, and I'm sure it is an anchor in a lot of people's definitions too. Having been on this show, and I've talked to quite a few guests about it. So why do you think it is such an important aspect of happiness?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's because, one researcher, Barbara Friedrichsen, she's done a lot of research on positive emotions. And there's like 10 key positive emotions that she's done research on. And one of those, there's things like gratitude and, serenity and pride and joy. And the one that she really thinks is like the mother of all positive emotions is love. And in one of her books, she talked about how the reason for that is that it's when we are experiencing one of those or multiple of those other positive emotions in the presence of a close other that we experience love. And love doesn't have to be romantic. Like it's a powerful emotion that can be platonic. It's a beautiful thing. It's really good for us. And so I think, that's what I would start with. People who are surrounded by other people tend to be the happiest, in terms of the research. Those who have close friends and close relationships, they live the longest. The number one predictor of longevity and life satisfaction in the longest study in history from, can't remember his first name, Waldinger, at Harvard, it's close relationships, right? And people who are the happiest have a diverse social network and have close friendships. And in those friendships, like you mentioned earlier, a friendship can be with somebody who you're not related to, who's like kind of like a chosen family, right? Like, but also it can be your brother or your mom or, your sister-in-law or whatever. Like, it can be anybody who's a family member or not a family member. And so, I think happiness, one of the keys to happiness is also meaning. And if you break meaning down, which Emily Esfahani Smith has done a really good job of, a lot of the aspects of meaning have to do with relationships. One of the pillars that she names is belonging. And, she talks about purpose, transcendence, storytelling, and belonging as the 4 pillars of meaning. And belonging, I think, is a huge one. But I also think, a lot of times, and it's not required, but I think a lot of times the most transcendent experiences we can have are in the presence of other people. Or you have a relationship, and this is kind of going out there a little bit, but you may have a relationship in that transcendence with some sort of higher power, right? Or some sort of, being that you believe in. And you actually have like the relationship that you can develop with that person, just like I had a role model who's a fictional character, right? Like we can develop relationships with people who are mystical. Maybe it's somebody who's passed on, who's an ancestor. Maybe it's, if we believe in God or some sort of higher power, like those are powerful relationships. And people who tend to have some sort of relationship with those types of mystical kind of beings or whatever, tend to be actually happier and healthier as well. So, there's a lot of other things too, but those are some that kind of pop into my head.
Yeah, definitely. But one of the things that you just mentioned is interesting, which is health, right? It can, social connection, social connectedness can improve our health. And I presume that this applies to both physical and mental health. But, in the psychology world, how does that actually work?
Yeah. So just to clarify, so from a psychological perspective, how, kind of what's the connection, right? Like what's...
Yeah. How does social connectedness, social connections actually improve our physical and mental health? Because, if you think about it, having friends and, being surrounded by communities, that sounds great. And, it's like a sense of belongingness. So to people who are not in psychology, we know that, okay, it's a great thing. But, with the, I think, principles of psychology and things that you've learned there, how does it actually work? And maybe they're I don't know, brain chemicals or, it boosts certain aspects of lives. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, great guesses. So, I think the title is Sero Boost, right? And that's based on serotonin, right? Serotonin levels. There's actually a lot of research on serotonin with regards to our perception of social status. And so, social status is a lot of that perception, which I think is probably very evolutionary, goes way back, right? Into okay, if we have high levels of serotonin, that means we feel pretty good about ourselves within our social structure. So that diversity of your network is going to really help with that. It's not the only thing that can help with serotonin. Touch is another one. The more people you have in your social network, the more likely you are to, engage in healthy touch with other people. There's a lot of really interesting research on the benefits of holding hands and of touch, and on all kinds of things, from, inflammation levels to, from the mental health standpoint, lower anxiety, higher sense of satisfaction with life. So there's lots of research there, and touch specifically, it's not the only thing that it activates, but touch is really good when it comes to oxytocin levels, which oxytocin is a very misunderstood neurochemical, but it is one of the good ones, and something that people don't necessarily talk about as much is endorphins, which are greatly, at least from one of the evolutionary psychologists, Robin Dunbar, talks a lot about the connection between touch and endorphins. So those are some of the pathways. A couple of things that I would mention too. So just from a practical standpoint, like if you have friends who are like, hey, like who have healthy habits, right? Then you're much more likely to have healthy habits. There's an interesting study by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler that talks about how bad health habits actually are contagious socially. It's crazy. Like I think up to like the third level of connection, like maybe you've heard of like, what is it? Seven levels to Kevin Bacon or something like that. It's like, I don't know if you've like heard that. It's like kind of a silly thing. Like everybody's like in some way connected to Kevin Bacon, but like, Google it. Anyways, but it's like,
I will.
But it's similar in that like up to three levels deep, we can be impacted by other people's health habits who we're connected to. And so, if we have friends who have really good health habits, we're most likely going to have good health habits, and vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then the last one I'd mention really briefly is what's called stress buffering. So like, if you feel supported, you're going to have less stress. And stress, as many people know, increases inflammation, does all kinds of bad stuff to your body. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. And I think that is the complete opposite of loneliness, which is something that you also study a lot. And we briefly mentioned this at the beginning. I guess the previous, correlation between social connections and health. Now I'm also guessing, and let me know if that is right, is the opposite of social connection or social connectedness would be loneliness. And for that, you would lack all of those chemicals, the great chemicals that you just mentioned, and that's how your health is affected. That's my guess. First of all, is that true? And second of all, is there more to that study about loneliness? Because we do know that it impacts our physiological, psychological health quite a bit. It impacts the body and the mind when we are in that state of loneliness.
Yeah, it's hard to say sometimes, but there is a lot of evidence. So in the research, like they always say, correlation is not causation, right? So we don't know like exactly why in some cases it's directly connected, to these outcomes, but the numbers are so, I guess, like the evidence is so compelling in terms of the statistics. That like, so one of the meta-analyses that was done talks about, and this was by my mentor, Julianne Holt-Lunstad in 2010, talks about how there's really, like the people who were socially connected and not, experiencing, severe, levels of loneliness, they survived 50%. They were 50% more likely to survive and like be alive, right? Like, and so it's like hard to argue with, death, as an outcome measure when it comes to, doing the numbers. But like, but yeah, I think there's so many different mechanisms that connect these, to, loneliness and health, social isolation and health. And I think there's a lot of, so one thing I'll just mention is, there's an area in the brain that is, kind of typically seen as like feeling physical pain, right? Whenever you like, if you're to like, I don't know, break your leg or something like that's really painful, like hopefully that would never happen to you. But if you did, you would feel it. And in this area of your brain. And the same area of your brain lights up when you experience social stress. One of the biggest social stresses is public speaking. Another really big social stress is loneliness. So, same area of the brain, it's an actual pain, right? There's actual emotional, like the brain doesn't like tell it apart. Like it hurts just as much as if you broke your leg, right? Really interesting study at MIT on looking at comparing hunger, actual like physical hunger, and loneliness. And they had people, they isolated people for 10 hours, and then they also made people fast to like not eat any food for 10 hours. And they looked at their brains, and it was the same area as well. That was like saying, hey, I need to survive, and they put a picture of friends connecting in front of them. And then they put a picture of like really juicy food in front of them. And it was the same area of the brain that was lighting up. So super interesting research. There's a lot of connection, and it makes sense because, we didn't survive because we were the strongest individual evolutionarily. We survived because we were a part of the strongest group. And to be a part of the strongest group, you have to have, there has to be a perception of belonging and being a part of the group. And if you are isolated, like that usually means death. You will probably die if you're ostracized from the group. So we haven't come far from that from a brain evolution standpoint.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, because I think some time ago on this podcast we talked about the fact that humans are social creature. We're not meant to be alone. And so I think it's magnified when you think about the different kinds of relationships and the quality of relationships that we have in our lives. And that is why, when you mentioned the different areas in the brain that was lighting up, I was kind of like, actually, you know what? It's survival, because we are meant to be surrounded by people. We're meant to have social connections, and even better when we have meaningful social connections. I think being surrounded by people all the time is not necessarily the answer. So having those meaningful connection is definitely the best thing that can happen. But going back a little bit to the beginning of the podcast where you mentioned social media, a lot of people find social media to be like the space to connect with others. And, it used to be built like that. And I know that now it's not actually the same thing. But sometimes the only way for you to connect with your closest friends is actually through social media or, virtually, not necessarily social media, but because we live in this digital world and, we just went through a pandemic, and everyone can relate to this, where, you basically stayed in touch with all your closest friends and even family through screens. And that was the only way to stay connected. Now, personally, I have a lot of friends, close friends, that are not living in the same city as I am, and not even in the same country. And it's quite hard to kind of like, have that connection in person. And I do believe that this is where, virtual connection can kind of help to substitute some of that. Because, unfortunately, sometimes it's hard to find people that you really connect with. And when you do, sometimes they move away. And, that is not necessarily a bad thing these days, because we can still connect with them. So how can we strike that balance between virtual connections and connection in person? Because I think we do need both, and we can actually have both. It's just that we need to have that healthy balance, right?
Such a good question. I think it's like $1 million question because, it's like a huge part of our life, like we mentioned before. And I have never really, kind of graphed this out. I really should, but I think there's some sort of a hierarchy that I'd like to kind of, maybe have people imagine in their heads. I don't have like a whiteboard right here, but if I did, I would say, in-person connection where you feel known, where you can optimally, touch like in healthy ways with somebody on as regular basis as possible. And honestly, like the touch, that can maybe even come from a pet, right? Like, and like we can get close to animals if we feel like we're not, like we don't have that, a person or people in our life as well. So just throwing that out there. So I would say like, in person, face to face, I mean, there's so much that happens between like with facial expression, with vocal attunement, like understanding expressions from people eye to eye, like that like our brains were like our brains are so attuned to faces. Like it's one of the first things that we are able to recognize as a baby. It's, once we are fully developed, like our brains recognize faces as either safe or not safe within like 1,000th of a second. Like there's so much brain power that's dedicated to faces. And if we are not using that like facial recognition software that we have installed into our brains, like we're really not taking advantage of what we have inside of us to connect with other people. There's not a ton of research on, video chatting and stuff like that. I've actually wanted to get involved in some of it, but yeah, like some say that like it's better than, so I would say in the hierarchy, right? Like in person, face to face, like being able to touch, right? Next one down, I would say, yeah, like if you don't ever have that, if you can't get that as often, absolutely, like FaceTime, Zoom, like Skype, whatever you want to call it, like, video calls where you in real time can see each other's facial expressions, hear each other's voices, see each other's eyes, like make the screen as big as you can get it, right? So that you can see as much of your face as you can. And yeah, like that's really, I would say the next one. And then phone calls, I would say is the next, is like, you can at least hear each other's voices and, you can riff on whatever, and there's that vocal attunement that you have. From there, there's all kinds of different things like, I don't know, video messaging, texting pictures, whatever. Yeah, but like, I would say those are the top ones, and use social media to, use those like online techniques with social media to get in person. So I did research with Eventbrite, and I don't know, it's so Eventbrite, just for anybody who hasn't heard of it, it's a tool that it's like an online kind of events management system that people can use to like buy tickets to events or whatever. And we did some research with them on this social connection project to see what kinds of events and what kind of characteristics of events were the most predictive of feeling more socially connected and less lonely, and the things that really came out in that research as helpful were going to events and engaging, like going to events that it required you to engage with other people, like actively, right? If you're just passively, kind of watching from the stands or from the audience, like it wasn't as helpful for improving your feeling of, loneliness and social connection. So use digital technologies like Eventbrite, like social media, to go to stuff in person and talk to people. Yeah, so it's awkward. That's part of it. Like that's part of it. It's like today I was actually leading a discussion with a community group, and I did something. I asked people to stand up who had been through a certain thing, and then I asked all these people who had stood up, who didn't know each other, to go and hug the other people. And like, it's awkward, right? Like, but
it is.
but they were so glad, like they were so glad that like afterwards, it's something that, they're like, oh, well, I'm never going to forget that, because they'd all been through a similar difficult situation, and now they knew each other too, and they could like connect on that thing. So, getting connected, self-disclosure is always going to come with a little bit of awkwardness. That's part of it. That's part of why we feel closer afterwards.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think making social connections is always going to start out a bit awkward. That's how you make friends. It's never going to be easy and organic the first time anyway. It is going to be a little bit awkward, but later on, when you actually have found the connection, it truly is great. One of my, I think one of my greatest friends and I, we started out being awkward neighbors on balcony, and that's like one of the best things that I ever did. Try to talk to my neighbor on the balcony in the pandemic. It was so awkward, but it was so worth it.
I love it.
And yeah, and I think we should do more of the things that kind of scare us or kind of feel a bit awkward, because that would really, really help. Now, I know that I think in your work, probably in one of the research or one of the things that you have written, you mentioned something also about connections with your co-workers or your colleagues. And I think you mentioned that in our conversation earlier as well. But I think that this connection with, colleagues, co-workers, it is kind of tricky sometimes, especially now we have a lot of virtual teams, right? But it's still a big part, even if you can't really meet in person. Because I know that for me and my team at the moment, most of the colleagues that I'm closest with, we kind of, we call, we talk on the phone or we text more than anything because we cannot meet in person. Now, the workplace connections, they are important for, our social connectedness, but I think also for productivity and so many other things. What can employers or, organizations actually do to help foster these connections? Because we know they're so important, right? In life, there are so many things that we can't really predict. There's no one that's going to kind of be like monitoring your connections with people around you. But, in the workplace, it's kind of a controlled environment, and there are a lot of things I'm sure we can do. So what would be some of the things that organizations should start doing to help their workers feel a little less lonely, feel more connected, and that can improve everyone's health?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we spend like 80 to 90,000 hours of our lives at work, and whether that's remote or in person, right? And so I think it's something we really should take advantage of when it comes to relationships, is our workplace. And something that they can do, I would say a couple things. One is if it is hybrid, a lot of people have hybrid remote is kind of like the default now. And if possible, coordinate the days that like you're going in, right? Or like, because if everybody's hybrid and everybody's hybrid, or like in-person day at the office is totally different, then like, it's like kind of a toss up, and you never know who's going to be in when. But like, as a manager, I would suggest like, hey, let's cool. You guys are, Monday through Thursday or whatever it is, like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are like in office, and just like coordinate the days that you're in, right? And the days you're out, like coordinate those too, so that you can actually see each other. So that's like just bare bones, right? And then I would say if there's any way that you can create moments of connection, either at the beginning, I would say at the beginning of meetings where it's possible, right? And I know meetings can be controversial, but where it's possible, have encourage a moment of connection. And that can just be, it doesn't have to be like super vulnerable or like, tons of self-disclosure. It can be positive self-disclosure too. It can be like, hey, what was the best thing about your weekend? Or like, let's talk, and especially if it's virtual and it's like, hey guys, let's show up 5 minutes early and, talk about like whatever your favorite thing was, about this week, this last week. And like, that's a good way to capitalize on like what's going well too, on your team. it's a good way to establish psychological safety as well, which is the number one predictor of successful teams is psychological safety. And then, one thing I actually really loved, and I know not every company has the budget to do this, but this one company, it was actually a pretty small company. They did this really cool thing where the company that actually gave, like they paid the employees a certain amount of money that could only be used for like doing good, like for like helping somebody else. Mm-hmm. And or it could be like just donating it to a cause or whatever. Like they had to use it to do something that was meaningful to them and that was good for the world. And so then I think it was like once a month at least, they would then get together because I think they only get paid once a month, right? For this specific thing. And they got together and they shared what they did. And it's like so cool because it's like, it's kind of a brag session for one, right? Like, so it makes it less awkward because you're like, well, but everybody did it, right? So it's not like you're the only one who's like the good guy. Like, so it was just so cool. And like people were crying and like, it was really connective. But it's also cool because it's like super good for the PR of that company too. Because it's like, hey, we do this really cool thing, anyways, so that was a company, it was like a marketing agency called Lemonade Stand. And they did this, it's just a cool, activity they do for their employees. And I think it's worth, so worth, I don't know how much they'd have to budget for that, but like, it's totally worth it, even if it's like $50 a person or $20 a person, like it's worth it for the health and psychological benefits.
Yeah, definitely. That company sounds really cool and they are doing something right there. I think I'm really glad to hear stories like that. It's really helpful. And I think all organizations should try and do something even with or without budget. There are things we can do. I think that encouragement to connect sometimes lack because it's kind of like, oh, it's business as usual. So you got to get into it, like what is it on the agenda? And I think that's where lots of companies fail to not have that moment of connection. And so, I really like, having random chats with my team as well. And one of the funniest thing happened the other day, because, sometimes we start the meeting with a funny check-in question, or we would just talk about our weekend or something like that. But midway through our meeting, somebody was not on mute and some incident happened. They were on a phone call with the grocery place and then, supermarket. And then they started talking about salmon. And then the whole team started talking about salmon. And then ever since that conversation, we have been using salmon as a social glue to our conversations. So actually that person's going to QA this episode. So they'll be glad to hear that really fosters social connection. So our team bonded over salmon. Even the vegetarians could kind of weigh in. Oh, I don't eat salmon, but here's how I eat so-and-so. That's really, really fun. And I think, that connection at work is so important because you're so right in saying we spend 80,000, 90,000 hours working in our lives. Yeah. That's a lot of time. And so for you to not connect to your team, I think it can be detrimental to your health, given what we just discussed today, right? So this is so important. We spend so much time at work. Thank you for sharing that insight. And now for our audience who would like to get a bit practical, let's go into the practice part. What is a practice you would recommend to people to cultivate this sense of social connectedness? Maybe bring in more social connections.
Yeah. So, something that I've been doing for the last, 3 or 4 or 5 years is I take pictures. I don't know how many pictures we all have on our phones, right? Like, and maybe we have a picture on our phone that's just buried deep in our Photos app or whatever the app is where you keep all your pictures, and you don't really look at it very often. So I just used like one of these free apps. There's actually a lot of free apps, and depending on where you live, there's got to be something where you can go to a store, and just choose some pictures, make a little album, and choose some pictures of people of you with people that you love or it doesn't even have to be you with them. Like you can just text them and say, hey, send me a picture of you that I can print off. I know it's kind of awkward, but
that is awkward.
But you know, I can't show you right now with the camera, but I have you know, a bunch of these pictures up on my wall. I call it my friendship wall. And it's a good reminder because I look up and in those times when I'm just like, gosh, you know what? I don't feel like anybody really cares about me, because everybody has those moments, no matter how connected you are. Like there's always a time when you might feel a little bit lonely. It's just a human thing. And so I'm able to look up at that and say, wait a second, I am still friends with Ryan, or like I have my friend Bethany, or like Adam, or you know, like I look at all these friends that are up there and I'm like, okay, maybe some of these pictures need to be updated and I need to replace them with somebody else. That's actually true.
Yeah, bitter truth.
Yeah, and that's a very normal thing, you know, for friends to kind of come and go. But a lot of them I'm really close to, and I love looking up there and saying, gosh, you know what? Like, I feel really close to Lewis today, and I really did actually. And I reached out to my friend Lewis, and I was like, just want to say I was thinking about you, you know, and so that has encouraged me to then reach out, whether it's by text, you know, to start that hierarchy, right? Like you got to start somewhere, you know, and start the conversation. So.
Yeah, I really love that practice actually, because I used to do that and then I stopped because, you know, you just have so many photos and then you kind of like, you got to reshuffle them, but then, you know, print new ones because you have new friends now, you know, life happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great reminder. And for those that haven't done that before, I think it's a great thing to do. You know, I really love having pictures of my friends and people that I'm close to on the wall. It's a really nice reminder that life's great. You know, you have all these amazing people around you. And this is such a great topic that we've covered today. But before we let you go, we've got open mic. Is there anything today that you would like to share with us, not on this topic? I know you have something else in mind, so the floors are yours. Go for it.
Well, you know, I think it's pretty common for a lot of people to experience anxiety. I think depression and anxiety are the most common like mental health struggles globally. They're both like very huge issues with regards to disability, you know, speaking of work. And it's something that I personally have in the past, you know, couple years ago, I had really hard time with anxiety to the point it was like, you know, having panic attacks and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so, you know, if you're one of those people who are, you know, having panic attacks or even just the slightest anxiety, social anxiety at all, you're not alone. And, you know, there's a lot of great things that can help. And I don't know, I think it's important to normalize, you know, just the fact that mental illness exists. Like I've struggled, my wife has struggled, like, you know, it's okay to struggle. And I think that's kind of maybe the main thing is like, it's okay to struggle. I think that helped me the most is to be able to just admit it and talk to my friends about it, you know, and say, hey, you know what, I'm feeling like kind of anxious right now, but I still want to come hang out with you because I want to be able to like get through this and like work through it with you, if that's okay. And when I say that, like, it's really hard. It was first time I said that was really hard to say. But saying that actually was one of the things that helped me to break the patterns, right? And like to get through that and be able to go and be with the people who care about me. Because I think anxiety and probably depression too, like it can just kind of change the narrative inside your own head about what you think people think about you. And so to break that, you know, there's all kind of like, it doesn't matter how much you talk to yourself, like you just have to go and you have to be with those people and you have to ask them, what do you think about me? And most of the time they think you're awesome. Right. And so I think, I just wanted to say that, you know, it's okay if you do feel like you're having a hard time with anxiety, And especially with this topic of social connection, because like we said, it is awkward. It can be really awkward to connect with somebody in a way that you haven't before, and to share something that will help you to truly feel known and seen, right? Because if you don't feel like you are actually known and like seen for who you really are, you are going to feel lonely. Even if you have friends and they don't know you, you'll feel lonely. So yeah, I just think it's a big deal. Everybody probably feels anxiety about it to some degree. And so even somebody like me, you know, who has a podcast and does speeches and coaches people for their TEDx talks, and like, I also get anxiety, you know, like, it's okay, you know? So, yeah, anyways, that's what I'd like to share.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful message, especially for a show about happiness. And you know, we appreciate your honesty and openness and for sharing everything today. And you know, for our audience who would like to get to know more about you or get in touch for a collaboration, or maybe want to join your podcast, where should they go?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at morehappylife, morehappylife.co. And yeah, you can also just look me up on LinkedIn, Andy Proctor. There's probably a lot of Andy Proctors, but you know, just look for the guy that's a PhD student. I don't know. So.
Yeah, that's a great clue. Thank you for that. And thanks again for being here today. I think it's been a wonderful chat, and I'll make sure to print out photos of my friends, you know, my updated social circle, and put them up on my wall.
Okay, good. I got to update mine too.
Yeah, great. You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.